Friends, hello to all of you. Surfer layabouts, my favorite deviants. Let me quickly tell you what's happening in the world. So Trump, without thinking, without planning, without a strategy, got involved in Iran. Now he's frantically looking for ways to get out of the Iranian trap that Hexet and his associates pulled him into. So the American Office of Simple Solutions never had a strategy to begin with. They thought everything would work out quickly, but when it didn't, they started scratching their heads and wondering how to get out of this trap, because it has called into question the future of all of Trump's ambitious plans. At this point, it's clear that he doesn't stand a chance in the upcoming elections for Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, which will be held in November. In short, things look bleak for him, and most likely both chambers could be lost. Trump is trying to find a way out of this situation and starts floundering, turning to his so-called allies, people he doesn't really consider allies, whom he often sees as beggars. Well, he didn't call them beggars outright, but you could see how he would go around asking for help. So it turned out that help was needed because they couldn't resolve this on their own. More precisely, what was needed was an expansion of legitimacy. For this operation in Iran, and for that, European allies are needed, their bases are needed, because Europe, as we know, is reluctant to take part in this adventure and only does so to a limited extent. That's why the British press is now sarcastically discussing Trump's proposal to assist, so to speak, in this Iranian adventure. And Starmer, who not long ago Trump was being called not Churchill, and now quite justifiably he can be called not Roosevelt either. So all this business is directly related to us because Trump urgently needs victories, and he is now putting maximum pressure on Ukraine in order to achieve this victory. Moreover, it's clear that the Russians are also putting pressure on Trump because Trump is now in a weak position. He is in a weak position with regard to Europe. For the Russians, naturally, he is in a weak position, and for China, he is in a weak position as well. And everyone is now taking full advantage of the mistakes that Trump has made accordingly. And naturally, the Russians are arranging everything in such a way as to get from Trump the concession they need from Ukraine's withdrawal from the territory of Donbass. And in exchange for assistance regarding the situation with Iran, especially since Russia is directly involved in it, information has already leaked to the press that Iran, that is Khamenei, the new leader of Iran, the son of the previous Khamenei, who was eliminated by the Americans, either the Americans or the Israelis, most likely the Israelis. And after he was seriously wounded, he is now undergoing treatment in Moscow. That is, most likely he is running the country from there, and accordingly, this is where the conflict of interest between the US and Russia arises. Because, of course, the US would prefer that the Iranian leadership does not feel safe. And of course, the Russian leadership would prefer that they do feel safe, because in this situation, Iran has become Russia's proxy. So we have a rather interesting arrangement where for China, Russia is a proxy. For Russia, Iran is a proxy. For Europe, Ukraine is a proxy, just as it is for the United States. In short, everyone is becoming a proxy for someone else. In this proxy system, each side tries to pursue its own interests, with the proxies bearing the greatest costs. That is, if we look at the confrontation between China and the US, we see that Russia as a proxy bears significant costs. If we look at Ukraine, we see how Ukraine bears the greatest costs as a proxy for the Americans and Europeans. And Iran bears the greatest costs acting as a proxy for Russia, although the relationship there is more complex, but I'm simplifying it here for clarity. So it follows quite naturally then that there's this real sense of urgency. Trump needs to demonstrate some very rapid and tangible results on the situation in Ukraine, because this could actually become a major defining success for his administration's foreign policy. At this stage, it's something that can be presented and used as a bargaining chip in certain combinations within domestic politics. In fact, this forces an increase in pressure on Ukraine and personally on Zelensky, who, understanding Trump's weakness and realizing that after the US midterm elections this November, the situation might improve. And now the whole logic becomes, if we can just hold out for a day, just survive one more day, then after the elections, something will change. At the very least, even if just one chamber is lost already, there will already be more room to maneuver. And if both chambers are lost, if Trump and the Democrats take everything, then there will be additional opportunities, which, however, will not solve our Ukrainian problem because they won't stop the war. They won't answer the question of where we are supposed to get people, where we are supposed to get energy, which is being destroyed. Today, there was an attack on the capital city of Kyiv again. It was yet another wave of strikes, and so on. So, in this ongoing confrontation with Trump, Zelensky is facing significant strategic challenges in the sense that Trump is currently placing his political bets on bunch Budanova and Arakamia, which should ensure the desired outcome, which should ensure peace. I have already said for a long time, several months ago, that when Budanov was appointed, Budanov was not a party of war, but a party of peace. And Trump needs this party of peace to gain control over power. And for that, well, accordingly, something needs to happen. And we see that something is happening because when these 60 deputies from Servant of the People make a statement that they are ready to resign their mandates because they are tired, well, I'm tired, I'm leaving. The old formula always works. By doing this, they create a threat that the parliament will stop working altogether, decisions will stop being made entirely, and they present Zelensky with a challenge. In other words, they're telling him, look, we're about to block the work of parliament and accordingly block the work of the government, and you'll be left alone with your problems. Zelensky responds to them saying, I'll make a decision right now. Some decisions that would allow deputies to be sent to the front, yes, but for that, something needs to be voted on. I don't think the deputies will vote against themselves. That's why there's this exchange of symbolic blows. Zelensky knows that they, as if they're holding an axe, are in such a joint game with the Americans, with the Trump administration. They in turn understand the limits of his resilience and they threaten, like, yes, Akhmetov is gathering, well, a meeting about the fact that the war could be long and messages are being sent out. All of this is being spread in order to, well, to scare both the population and the deputies accordingly. On the other hand, we see the infighting of the card office, represented by the remaining henchman Vladimir Petrov, who has lost his accomplice. Sergei Ivanov, who went to Karasi's unit. And all of this is being presented as patriotism, although in reality they were simply kicked away from the feeding trough. They were pushed aside, removed from Energoatom, and Ivanov immediately started scrambling as if to cover himself, but to hell with him. That's a secondary storyline. What isn't secondary is that today we see Edmontsev wrote that, so Petrov is there going blah, 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 this and that, he's bad, that he doesn't represent the opinion of everyone, like of the whole government, and in general he's nobody to Vatiev, he's nothing, he's from Yermak's gang. So there's clearly a contradiction between. This just emphasizes it even more. This is exactly the contradiction I mentioned, that there is Zelensky, that is the president's office, which today is headed by Budanov, and it no longer operates the way it used to when Yermak was in charge, like back then. And that's why we see such a lack of coordination in the messages. Because one part is working on one thing, another on something else, a third on yet another, and so on. And Zhelezniak aptly pointed out that these contradictions regarding the configuration of conducting the war, relations with the Trump administration, relations with Europe, and so on, and also about how to exit the war. Right now, these issues are being weakly communicated from Zelensky's side, but that's not surprising. It's only surprising if you look at the office as a unified whole, functioning as a single organism. But that's no longer the case after RMK's resignation. It's simply gone. As a result, the president makes statements, but they don't get developed further. They don't progress. And all of this, so to speak, just sinks into this swamp, in the swamp of that complex configuration that has developed in the world regarding Ukraine, regarding Iran, regarding relations between the US and China, the US and Russia, the US and Europe, Europe and Russia, and so on. The Russians, understanding that Trump is in a weak position right now, are allowing themselves to behave rudely. And we see this whole squabble about how Ushakov told off the French with some choice words when they demanded to be seated at the table. Because, of course, when it comes to Europe, the Russians do not see Europe as a real player and behave accordingly because they think they have come close to finally trying to, so to speak, push Ukraine to the end. And with the Americans joining in, to thereby resolve for themselves the issue of formalizing their victory, because they want to have an argument they can clearly present that they started the war for Donbass, they won it, and they are so great and accomplished. And then from there, to use political methods to play on the internal conflict within Ukraine. And we see Dennis, they analyze this well. All these statements from military correspondents, all sorts of internal Russian bloggers and the like, about how the war has already, so to speak, reached its limit and it needs to be ended and so on. And this kind of narrative is being constructed for the domestic audience, providing arguments as to why it makes sense to pull out, even though at the same time Putin is preparing summer offensives. Although in reality, he prepares summer offensives every year. And last year, just the same, everyone was expecting a summer offensive in the spring, but it turned out to be permanent. And the only thing that might distinguish this offensive from the previous one is that they might try to concentrate more troops in order to, as is sometimes leaked in Russian social media, carry out some kind of operational breakthrough. Well, the question remains open as to where they will get the people, the weapons, and all that. That is the core of the issue. For us, the most significant and pressing challenge is that Trump has a complete and total lack of understanding regarding Ukraine, about the complex geopolitical situation that will unfold after the war finally ends. That is, he needs a quick solution to resolve the issue, and then, as they say, move along, to switch to other matters in the context of the election campaign, in the context of the presidential elections that are already looming on the horizon. And so on and so on and so on. And just like with Iran, they started the war in the spirit of Napoleon, believing that the main thing is to get into the fight and then we'll see what happens. He has exactly the same approach with Ukraine. And it is destructive for Ukraine. In principle, it is destructive in the complex situation the world is in. It is destructive for everyone, and above all for its own United States of America, because everyone understands that the US today is extremely unstable, extremely unpredictable, extremely irresponsible, and as a result, extremely unreliable. And as a consequence, well, they are an ally that is hard to even call an ally because they constantly bring problems with them. And everyone has already realized this. And that's why now everyone is for themselves. Everyone is trying to save themselves. As best he can, Zelensky goes to Europe, meets with Macron there. As they say, it seems they had a pretty good conversation, and tries to find points that would strengthen his stability. On the contrary, the Americans are playing to undermine Zelensky's stability, and that's why, surely in the coming weeks and months, we will see a surge in activity from NABU and other anti-corruption agencies. Regarding who did what, how, and where, no doubt about it, this will happen, with all the resulting consequences. In other words, we won't be bored, but the summary is this. That's the summary. We simply, our planet Earth have just gone off the rails. The situation has spun out of control. Anything can happen because the situation with Iran could force Trump to resort to tactical nuclear strikes if they send in ground forces and special operations units. They've already started deploying various Navy SEALs and will try to seize Kark Island in order to grab the Iranians by their oil assets. But it's absolutely clear that this strategy isn't really a strategy at all. It's just a tactical move to improve their position, and it could lead to anything. They could get bogged down, they could be defeated, they could get stuck there for a long time, and then the Iranians would start sending in suicide bombers. There are missiles there. Any further increase in losses, especially right before the elections, would be a huge problem. And then Trump might just slam his fist on the table and decide to use tactical nuclear weapons against Iran, drop a couple of warheads there to show his strength, and guided by the expediency of achieving great American victories. So you understand what kind of consequences this would have for us, because Putin would immediately have his hands untied to achieve such a strategic breakthrough. And in relation to us, as I said back in March 2022, as soon as they run into the inability to resolve the issue of defeating Ukraine by conventional means, the only argument they will have left is tactical nuclear weapons, which they could use against Ukraine. Trump is operating under exactly the same logic. The inability to achieve a quick victory over Iran, the threat of getting dragged in right before the elections, into a long-term war, and Iran understands this very well, and its leadership constantly says so. No, 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 we are not going to get involved. No, 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 we'll let these ones through. The Chinese will let them through, but we won't let those ones through, and we'll inflict the maximum possible costs to the US allies and above all the Emirates, Saudi Arabia. There were strikes yesterday on oil terminals in Fujairah, so the Iranians understand that for them, prolonging the war by even a month brings benefits because it will force Trump to look for a way to get out of this war. So now the question everywhere is how to get out of this war in Ukraine and Russia. How can the states get out with Iran? Israel is facing the same question because Israel basically, as David Gendelman said on my broadcast, their task is to hit as many targets as possible while this situation continues. Europe is just kind of trying to find itself, but as always, it's doing it very slowly, as always, with delays, as always, making decisions too late. And well, this is a very, very frightening prospect, especially for us as a country that said the is in a weak position, extremely dependent on external support, and burdened with a huge array of internal problems. But who said it would be easy? That's how things are. Hang in there.